Ways we have to influence, to teach, and to inspire. Storytelling builds connections among people, and it builds connections between people and ideas. Storytelling reveals our history, our culture, and our values. And when it comes to family and to communities, we understand that these stories we share, they are a large part of the ties that bind us all together. And so this was not lost on the people of Jesus' day. Parables were a very common form of teaching, and Jesus would be considered a master craftsman of them. In Luke 15, we find that Jesus is eating with sinners, as the Pharisees say. Now, the Pharisees' idea of sinner is someone who has willingly chosen to separate themselves from the community of God's people. And so when they say sinner, and when I say sinner, this is the idea that's going to be used this morning. This idea of people who have willingly separated themselves from the community of God's people. And so they're correct in their assessment. Jesus has, in fact, welcomed sinners, and he is eating with them. He has invited them into this relationship. And his response to the Pharisees is this 3-in-1 parable where each story builds on the truth of the one before it. And so we turn to verse 4 of Luke 15. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost, until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together the friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, we're going to move quickly through these first two so that we can get to this third one and spend most of our time there. This talk of shepherds would have brought to mind, remember Jesus is talking to Pharisees, this would have brought to mind passages from the Old Testament on shepherding. This isn't said in a vacuum. Psalm 23 would have come to mind. Most likely Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34 are coming to mind, these places where images of shepherds and sheep are spoken of. And what we see is in Psalm 23, God is the shepherd. The Lord is our shepherd, right? And in the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they add to this imagery the idea of bad shepherds, because they are in a time in which Israel's leaders are not doing what they should, and so these are bad shepherds. And Ezekiel even shows us that a time is coming when the Lord himself will come. He will remove the flock from these bad shepherds, and he will be their shepherd. He will go out and find his lost sheep, and he will return them. He'll bring back those that have strayed. And the word used there for bringing back the strayed that Ezekiel uses is shub. And this is the word in Hebrew that they use for repentance or for restoration. And so already we're getting an idea of where Jesus is going with this story. And what we cannot miss in this first parable, what we cannot miss is that we have to go searching for the lost. The lost will not come home on their own. They're lost. If they could come home on their own, they wouldn't be lost. We have to go seeking the lost. And the shub that Ezekiel speaks of, it does not come at the expense of the sheep. It comes at the expense of the shepherd. It is the shepherd who makes the trek through the wilderness searching for this sheep. It is the shepherd who once finds the sheep, puts it on his shoulders, and makes the return journey back home and returns the sheep to his home. The cost of seeking is on the shepherd, not the sheep. And this is what we can't miss from the first story. And once the shepherd returns the sheep home, the community celebrates. There's great celebration. The community rejoices because the sheep has been restored. Let's move on to the next story in verse 8. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost. Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So again, these stories build off of one another. And so what does this story reveal to us that the story of the lost sheep does not? Well, there's two things we see here. First is the admittance of the woman. Who lost the coin? She did. She lost the coin and she begins searching. She begins seeking. The houses then aren't very well lit. They probably had just a few slits at the top for ventilation, and that was about it. You can picture this dark quarters, and she's searching it with this little oil lamp that's probably not giving much light. She is searching diligently for what she has lost. And this removes any idea of that from the first parable, because you could say, well, the sheep wandered off. Okay, but if the shepherd returns the flock without that one, who's the owner going to say lost the sheep? The shepherd. So the shepherd and the woman both lose these things, but they search diligently for them. The second truth we see from this story, adding to Jesus' overall parable, is the value of that which is lost. Now, with the sheep, we could say, okay, well, it got sick when it strayed away, or maybe it damaged its wool, and somehow this sheep is now less valuable. But there's no room for that in this story. The coin was worth a day's wages when she had all 10 coins together. It was worth a day's wages when it was lost, and it was worth a day's wages still when it was found. The coin's value does not change. What is lost is still very much valuable. And obviously, we're now not talking about coins, we're talking about souls. Souls exponentially more valuable than coins. And remember, they don't come home on their own. We have to go seeking. So now we turn to Jesus' final story. And this is where we'll spend most of our time. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed by the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. So with this story, we can kind of break it down into 2 different acts. The first act is the father finding his younger son, and the second act is the father finding his older son. It's also important that we pay attention to the father in this story, because there are 5 instances in which the father does something out of the norm. There's 5 instances in which traditional Middle Eastern culture would have dictated the father respond a certain way, and Jesus tells this story and the father acts completely different. And so the first of these instances is in verse 12. The younger son comes to his father and demands his inheritance from him while the father is still living. The insult of the younger son would be equivalent to your child coming to you and basically saying, I really wish you would just go ahead and die so I could have your money. And this is what the younger son has done. He has demanded his inheritance from his father that should come after his father passes away. And Middle Eastern tradition, culture would have said, you strike the son, you deny his request, and you drive him from his home. But that is not what the Father does. He grants his son this request, this outrageous request. And even beyond that, he allows him to sell this property. And so here we see community comes into the story. Now, community is always just kind of off stage until the very end. The community in which they are a part of is just off stage, but it's always there. For example, the son has to sell this property to someone. It would be the community, making this whole thing even worse because now it's a public thing. The community knows very well what the son has done, and shame has now been brought to the whole family. And they are outraged by this. We know this because the son leaves quickly. They're angry with him. And so the son leaves and he goes off to a far country. The other way we know the community is a big part of this story is in that day there was a shame ceremony. And we know Jesus has this in mind because this is the shame ceremony. And this is who it's for and how it works. All right, you ready? If a son loses his father's inheritance to a Gentile people, then he will, if he returns home, will face this ceremony. And what does the younger son do? He takes his father's inheritance, goes off to a far country, presumably Gentile because he's herding pigs, and he loses his father's inheritance. Now, should the boy dare return home, he will face this ceremony in which they burn these corn husks and they break them in front of him, and they pretty much pronounce that he's cut off from his people, that he's dead to them, and there's no more assistance of any kind from that community for that individual. So the boy knows, I'm in trouble. I'm not just in need, but I can't go home because I'll be returning empty-handed, and they'll turn me away. And so this idea comes to the boy, okay, well, let me work for some people here, and maybe I can regain what I've lost, and then I'll be accepted back home. Only problem with that plan is you can't predict Mother Nature, and Mother Nature said there's going to be a famine, and now the boy is in need, and no one's giving him anything because there's really not much to give. So the boy is hungry, and he can't go home. Picking up in verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him and the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, put shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. I think where most often we get tripped up with this story Jesus is telling is when he says he came to himself. Our translations often read that way. And we interpret that, okay, well, he comes to his senses with the idea of there's a change of heart, there's this repentance that takes place, and now he's on his way home. That's good and all, but he's still got to deal with the community. And not only that, there's a problem with this interpretation because it does not align with what Jesus just said. In the story of the lost sheep, the sheep contributed nothing to being found. It was all on the shepherd to go find the sheep. In the story of the coin contributed nothing to being found. It was all on the woman to search and seek out that coin. The son is lost. He cannot contribute anything to being found, or else Jesus doesn't know what he's saying, and that obviously is not the case. Because if that's the case, we have a theological contradiction, and this is just all confusing. If the younger son manages to make his way on his own efforts, then the third story is the exact opposite of the first two. So how do we reconcile this? Well, I think a better understanding would be he returned to himself. Again, this language of shepherds would have brought to mind these Old Testament passages. And we see in Psalm 23, it is the Lord who returns David to himself. And in Jeremiah 23 and in Ezekiel 34, it is the Lord who returns the people to the land. Who is the Son returning to? He's not returning to God. He's not returning to the land, but he's returning to himself. In other words, I've got one last plan. This is my last-ditch effort. This is how I can earn my redemption. And this idea is unveiled in the following verses. I will return home not to be my father's son, but to gain training, to gain skill, so that I can work off what I've lost and earn my way back into this family, this community, and in the good favor of my father. He says, treat me as your hired servant. Hired being the key word. He's looking for gain. He's looking to earn back. And in case we don't pick up on this, there's even more to suggest that this is not a sincere repentance. Because the way this plan is right now, the father is just another tool to be manipulated to get what the son wants. You give me training, and then I'll get what I want. But we see that he's in this plan he has, this speech he's going to touch his father's heart with, begins with, I've sinned against heaven and before you. Now this may seem very genuine. That's why it's a good scheme. The Pharisees, again, this is who Jesus is talking to, would have picked up on this. Because this comes from a very important story of Israel's history. In Exodus, the 9th plague has just taken place. And Pharaoh, who had long refused to meet with Moses, now finally agrees to meet with him. And Pharaoh's plan is to say whatever is necessary to get Moses to pray to God to lift these plagues so that Egypt can go on about its business. And he has no intentions of keeping anything he says. So Moses arrives before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh begins speaking to Moses by saying, I've sinned against the Lord your God and you. Almost word for word what the son says to the father in this scheme of his. Now it will transform in meaning here in a moment, but we see this plan is still, I'm going to earn my redemption. I don't need grace. I'm going to save myself by the law, yet I can do this on my own. So he thinks. Now, what's interesting is the father seems to know the son's going to fail. He seems to suspect this. He's watching, looking for his son to return. You can almost picture him looking out over the village, whatever direction his son left in, hoping to see him returning on the horizon. And the father knows what awaits the son should he return empty-handed as he suspects. That this ceremony will take place and his son will be cut off forever. So the father has a plan. If he can reach the son before the son reaches the community, if he can get to his son before the son gets to the village, and he can reconcile with his son in public, then the community cannot treat him harshly. But it will come at great cost to the father. And so we see that the father has already taken on a great deal of shame from his son's actions. For the second time, he will take on a great deal of shame. This is a shame-honor culture, so this is not just a small thing to these people. This is a great price for this father to pay. The second time we see this father breaking from the norm is when he runs to meet his son. This may seem kind of odd to us a little bit, that running would be considered shameful for men, but you would have to lift up your robe, and in doing so would expose the man's legs, and that was considered shameful. Children ran. Women could run, but not men. Not in public. And so the father runs to his son down the streets, out the village. And in doing so, the attention is now on the father rather than the empty-handed son. The community is wondering, what is this guy doing running through the streets like a child? And they're not paying attention to the empty-handed son. He throws his arms around his son, and he welcomes him back. And he has robes put on, and a ring put on, and shoes put on, and they kill the fatted calf. They begin to celebrate. And he does all of this. He accepts him back. This extravagant demonstration of love takes place before the son has a chance to even say a word. Before the son can even enact his plan, before he can set into motion his scheme to manipulate his father, the father throws his arms around him and takes him back. Which means this love is a prelude to the confession, not a response. And so, overcome by emotion from this demonstration of his father, the son has a moment of genuine repentance. No longer is he going to go through with his plan that he had schemed. It's not that the father had interrupted him and he didn't have time to say what he was going to say. It's not that he forgot what he was going to say. It's that he had a moment of genuine repentance. And no longer was he going to try to save himself, but he was going to allow himself to be found by his father. The son accepts being found by the father. And this is the truth that adds to the previous stories. Because the father has found the lost son, word gets put out to the community, and a celebration begins. So we pick up in verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound." But he was angry, and he refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive, and he was lost and is found." This begins the opening of Act 2. There's a few interpretations of the meaning of this banquet we see in this story. The first two are the same, and that's what the father interprets this banquet to mean, and what the community interprets this banquet to mean, and that we understand that through the servant that tells the older son. The third interpretation is the older son's interpretation. So the community and the father understand this celebration is because the father, at great expense, went out after his son And he achieved shalom. He achieved peace. He took what was broken and reconciled it. He restored it. He repaired it. It was made whole. It's complete. It's done. It's over. He is his son. And this is what angers the older son. Because the older son took on shame as well from the younger son's actions. He was not spared that shame and even loses some of his inheritance most likely as a result of his brother's actions. And so the older son interprets the banquet differently. He does not see this as celebrating the father's success. He sees this as a party to celebrate his irresponsible brother and the fact that he's returned. So with these two interpretations of the banquet, we are forced to choose which is the actual interpretation. Which one makes the most sense? If the banquet is a celebration simply for the younger son's safe return, meaning he returns in good health, then the older son would be glad to come in because, boy, he's about to let him have it. Things aren't settled yet. But that's not what the servant tells the son. It has been settled. He has been reconciled. He has been restored. There has been repentance. And the younger son never had to pay for those sins. And this is what frustrates the older brother. For a son to be present at a father's banquet and not go in. Imagine you're at a holiday gathering with lots of family and friends, and you and your son are now in this yelling and screaming, arguing showdown in front of everyone. All right, that's basically what this is. It is an unspeakable public insult to not participate in your father's banquet when you are present. And the father breaks from the norm again. Tradition would say you ignore the son, you let him pout outside, you tend to your banquet and your guests, and then after the banquet's over, then you deal with the son. But he goes out to the son, taking on yet more shame from the community. And once outside, he pleads with the son to come into the banquet. And the son responds by lashing out at the father and attacking the son. And yet again, tradition would have said the father orders a lashing for the son because you don't speak to your father that way. But he doesn't do this. This costly demonstration of love shows that grace is offered to both sons. That both sons were in fact lost, and the father went to find them both. The younger son's response to this costly grace was acceptance of being found. The older son was unimpressed. If the older son accepts the love offered him by his father, then he has to in turn show and mean that same love to his brother. So the question is, will he decide to come into the banquet and begin learning to behave like his father? And Jesus ends it there. There's no conclusion. We don't know what the brother does. We don't know if he goes in. I think I think Jesus probably had an idea of how it should end, but he leaves it open. And in doing so, he places the Pharisees on stage, front and center. All right, yes, I have welcomed these sinners. The banquet's ready. The banquet's ready. The food's prepared. Everything's good to go. What are you going to do? Are you going to come in and join the celebration? Or are you going to stand outside? As we read this today, it places us front and center. And the questions that the Pharisees had to wrestle with in these three stories are the same questions we have to wrestle with now. Are we waiting for the lost to return on their own? Or are we willing to go seeking the lost, even at great expense and at great cost to ourselves? Do we realize the value of the lost? Or have we fallen into this falsehood that somehow the lost are less valuable? And even tougher, have we contributed to the lost being lost? Either directly by something we've said or done, or indirectly by something we haven't said or done, and that we're not seeking them. Are we still trying to earn our way back into the good favor of our Father? And in our schemes to right our own wrongs, are we failing to see that the bigger problem is the broken relationship, not the broken law? Can we accept being found by the Father? Our prodigal brothers and sisters await us in the banquet. What are we going to do with them? What are we going to do with Jesus? And our answers to these questions affect how this story plays out in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Maybe you have a prodigal in your family. Maybe you are the prodigal in your family. And maybe you're lucky enough to not know that pain, but your responses matter too, because you make up the community in which the prodigal returns. And in these stories, the community always celebrates the return of the lost. The community always rejoices when the lost are restored. Luke 15 begins and ends with sinners at a table eating a meal with Jesus. And Jesus, at great cost, seeks out the lost, seeks out the sinners. We can't bring that repentance, we can't bring that restoration. That is his job, but we can go seeking. And are we willing to go in and celebrate? Anytime we come together like this as a community of believers, we always want to offer a time of invitation. And maybe, again, you have a prodigal in your life, and it's not going how you want. And you just need the encouragement, the strength, and the prayers of your community. We have elders who line the walls and come down front. Please let us help if that's the case. And maybe you are more in line with the prodigal, and you've been scheming and planning on how to earn your way back, but have grown tired of that and are ready to accept being found by Jesus and putting him on in baptism. The celebration is ready. The question is, will we go in? Whatever your need is, please come as we stand and as we sing.